Contributing to open source project is great. But how would you feel if your code is used to oppress minorities, to influence in democratic elections, or even worse, actively participate in wars and genocides? With great power comes great responsibility, and it's crucial to consider the implications of your code and the projects that we contribute to. Today in Code of Culture, we will discuss the ethics in the open source world. Before we dive into the ethics of the open source, let's first discuss the three principles of ethics: autonomy, beneficence, and non-maleficence. Autonomy refers to the principle of respecting an individual's right to make their own decisions. Beneficence involves taking actions that promote the well-being of others. And non-maleficence refers to the principle of avoiding actions that cause harm. These principles are crucial when considering the ethical implications of the open source projects. These principles of ethics in open source are often overlooked and can result in harm to users and communities. For example, the autonomy principle can be violated when software is designed to gather personal data without user consent, such as the case of the audio editor Audacity that included some spyware in its code. Additionally, the non-harm principle can be violated when the software is used in ways that harm individuals or groups, such as when the fitness application Strava inadvertently revealed the locations and routines of military personnel stationed overseas, potentially putting them at risk. Even if this is not an open source project itself, it uses open source libraries. Now that we have covered the three principles of ethics, let's take a look in more detail at some real-world examples on how open source projects have been used in unethical ways. One well-known case is that of Cambridge Analytica, the data analytic firm that was hired by the Trump campaign during 2016 in the US presidential election. Cambridge Analytica used Facebook data to create psychographic profiles of millions of voters, which were then used to target them with personalized political advertisements. And guess what? The software that they used to process the data was built on top of an open source project called Apache Flink. Let's see another example. Kubernetes is an open source container orchestration system that has become increasingly popular in the recent years. It was originally created by Google, but it's now maintained by the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. However, some contributors to Kubernetes have expressed concerns about their code being used in military applications, such as combat F-16 airfighters. There is a YouTube video with the presentation of that in a KubeCon if you are interested. The programmers' concerns are that their contributions to the project could be used to facilitate violence and destruction, which goes against their personal ethical principles. These are just some examples, but there are many others out there. The point is that even if we are all well-intentioned open source contributors, you can't always control how your code will be used once it's out in the world. So, what can you do to prevent unethical use of the open source software that you created? There are two main scenarios. The first one is if you still have not started the project. In this case, one option is to use an ethical open source license, such as the Hipocratic license. This was developed by an open source advocate concerned about the impact of technology in society. The Hipocratic license is intended to ensure that the software is not used to harm people or violate human rights. It was created in 2019 by Caroline and Imke. She is an ethical source leader and also the creator of the Contributor Covenant. The organizations for ethical source work with their partner organization, the Corporate Accountability Lab, to create the Hippocratic License 3.0. The license is designed to prevent the unethical use of software in areas such as the human rights violations, discrimination, or environmental destruction. It is a reciprocal license based on the widely used MIT license, which means that anyone can use, modify, or distribute the software as long as they comply with the license terms. However, the license adds additional clauses configurable by anyone to suit their needs in its website, and this prohibits the use of software in a specific context. The Hipocratic license has been already adopted by a number of open source projects, for example, the React library Leaflet. It's worth noting that the Hipocratic license is not without controversy, with some critics arguing that it is too restrictive and could limit the potential uses of the open source software. While the Hipocratic license is a positive step forward promoting ethical uses of the open source software, it is not a perfect solution. For one, it relies on the compliance of those who use the software, and there is no guarantee that all the users will adhere to the license principle. Actually, enforcing the license can be challenging, as violations may be difficult to detect or to prove. It's also worth noting that the license's language is broad and open to interpretation, which could make it difficult to determine whether a particular use of the software violates the license or not. This could lead to legal challenges and disputes, which could ultimately be costly and time-consuming for all parties involved. Moreover, while the Hipocratic license can restrict certain uses of the software, it does not necessarily prevent the creation of new software with the same unethical applications. This is because the Hipocratic license is not considered to be a viral license in the same way that the GPL is. Viral licenses, like the GPL, require that the derivative works be licensed under the same terms as the original work. However, the Hipocratic license is a reciprocal one, which means that it requires that anyone who uses, modifies, or distributes the software also comply with the license term, but does not require that the derivative works be licensed under the same terms. However, open source licenses have proven effective, like in the case of the Free Software Foundations against Cisco. In 2008, the Free Software Foundation filed a lawsuit against Cisco for distributing products that included code from several open source projects without complying with the GPL. The case was settled out of court in 2011, with Cisco agreeing to appoint a free software director to ensure that it complied with the GPL, and to make a monetary contribution to the Free Software Foundation to support its ongoing work. While the terms of the settlement were confidential, it is estimated that Cisco paid several $millions to the Free Software Foundation. Even if this is a different license, it shows the possible consequences, including financial ones, that companies could have for not complying with open source licenses like the Hipocratic one. Another step could be to include a code of conduct for contributors that outlines the ethical expectations and behaviors. This can help foster a culture of responsibility and respect within the open source community. Additionally, some open source projects have created a review process to assess potential use cases and reject those that do not align with the project's values. While these steps cannot completely eliminate the risk of unethical uses of the open source software, they do provide tools and frameworks to contributors to prevent them. But what if the project has already started? Well, this is what happened to Seth Vargo, a software developer who deleted his open source code from online repositories to protest its potential use by the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Vargo's code was part of the tool called Chef, which helped to automate server configurations. While Vargo's code was not directly used, he felt that the company's use of Chef in their operations was unethical and went against his personal values. However, there are also cases where doing this, open source contributors lose the control over their projects. For example, developer Marak created a popular package called LeftPad on GitHub. When Marak decided to remove his code from GitHub, the action ended up breaking thousands of projects that relied on that package. GitHub, which is owned by Microsoft, ultimately stepped in and made the code available again and removed Marak's access to it for not abiding the terms and conditions of the platform regarding sabotage. But this incident raised questions about who has the control over the open source project and whether individual developers should have the right to remove their code as well, and open up another debate. While open source software has become a critical component on modern technology, the reliance on proprietary platforms like GitHub had raised concerns about the ownership and control of the open source projects. As a private company, GitHub has its own set of interests that may conflict with those of the individual developers and the open source community as a whole. Even more, the centralization of the open source code on platforms like GitHub creates a single point of failure and makes it vulnerable to censorship, control, or even appropriation by the platform itself, like it was argued when the tool Copilot was announced. This raises the question of whether a company can be a reliable and impartial host of most open source code, and what happens when the interests of the programmers and the platform come into conflict. So, if removing your code from the project is not an alternative, another option is to change the license of the project. But there are some other considerations. If you are the only contributor, there should be no problem. You can change the license. However, if there are other contributors, you must agree with all of them to change the license of the project. This is because the license is a written contract between the owner of the project and the contributors. A programmer writes code in your project under certain game rules, and one of them is the license of the project. If they refuse to change the license, either you maintain the license or remove the code of those programmers at the same time that the license is changed. However, this will prevent the unethical uses of the project in versions after the change of the license. Companies and governments will be able to use it without ethical restrictions in previous versions of the code, when the license was still unrestricted. In conclusion, the ethics of open source project is a topic that cannot be ignored. We must recognize that our code can be used for both good and evil, and we, the hackers and programmers, have the responsibility and the power to choose if we want our work to be used in one way or another. Thanks for watching this episode of Code of Culture, and remember, don't be evil.